This is a special pleasure for me to be able to introduce Professor Attia, who is a member of our Department of Counseling and Human Development. Mina's research covers trauma, adjustment of immigrants, refugees, and asylum seekers. He also does work on ethics and professional development in counseling, but I suspect that that has more general applicability. If I had to pick 4 or 5 words to summarize what I think are the highest priority issues that our nation is facing right now, many of them are embedded in exactly what I've just described about Mina's work. We are coming through a period of some trauma. With any luck and good science, some of the trauma from at least the pandemic will subside. But we have had the, shall we say, the reawakening of foundational problems in our society that have a lot to do with other forms of trauma, some of which have to do indeed with our attitude toward immigrants, refugees, and asylum seekers. And so I am just delighted that Mina is part of our GSEHD family, and today is going to be sharing with us some of his research having to do with trauma and adjustment in the LGBTQ plus asylum seeker community. It's really a great pleasure and honor, Mina, to have you doing this as part of our series. And
thank you so much, Dean Foyer, for that introduction and for the opportunity to share some of my work with you and with everybody here today. All right. So today I'm going to be talking about my latest study, which explores the experiences of trauma and adjustment of members of the LGBTQ plus community who are asylum seekers. I want to start off by going through a little bit of my background and what got me to be interested in working with this population, researching this population. So I am a trained clinical mental health counselor before becoming a counselor educator. I'm also a board certified counselor. And during my time as a PhD student, I did a lot of research, a lot of work on immigrant issues, refugee issues. It was a bit after all of the hype of the refugee crisis that was going on. And so I became very interested in looking at this population. And through that work, I started to see that there were gaps both in literature as well as in practice of counseling and the way that we are dealing with this population and providing services that are multiculturally competent and fitting really for the experiences of individuals who are specifically asylum seeking and members of the LGBTQ community. One of the biggest things was not addressing the intersectionality that is a part of having both of these identities and looking at this group as a homogenous group. So I became continually interested, and as a faculty member, last year was my first year here, I decided that this was a population that I was going to hone in on. And I spent some of my time connecting with the local community here in Washington, D.C., with organizations that provide services for this population. I also have a personal connection to the population because I came here with my family as asylum seekers. I'm also part of the community, and so I have that connection. I was fortunate to have the support of my family and to have the privilege of having them around. But I also certainly wondered what it would be like if I was going through this all on my own. So for today's lecture, I'm going to start off with a study overview, and then I'll talk about the different findings, and we'll discuss some discussion and implications of this study. So as we're getting started, I want to differentiate the difference between asylum seeker versus refugee. So asylum in itself is a form of protection for folks who meet the definition of being a refugee and are already in the United States or are seeking admission at a port of entry. The the refugee definition itself is that if you're a refugee, you're an individual who's been persecuted or feared that you'll be persecuted on account of race, religion, nationality, or membership in a particular social group or political opinion. So asylees are essentially refugees. One of the main differences here is that a refugee comes with that status, with that legal status as a refugee, but an asylum seeker comes to the United States and seeks this at a port of entry or after entering into the United States. And there are different means that folks come to the United States, one of them being visas. For example, some of the participants I'll talk about today talk about their experiences being on student visas and then applying for asylum. With that status, being a refugee versus being an asylum seeker, you get access to services. So refugees, for example, have refugee resettlement centers and have I would say a bit more robust of a system to welcome individuals into the country, but asylum seekers don't have any access to that. They don't have access to healthcare because they are considered to be undocumented at that point. So a bit more about the background of the LGBTQ community globally. We know that there are countries where same-sex activity is punishable by death, same-sex relationships are criminalized, and transgender individuals are brutally murdered. Here in the United States, we recognize that LGBTQ identity as well as HIV status are grounds for asylum. And there's this interesting paradox here that, while we have these protections in place, individuals who come to flee from the victimization that they've experienced back home are now coming, and especially nowadays with the media and TV and being able to see things as they're happening, we know that there's continued discrimination against the LGBTQ community, particularly trans individuals, even more so Black trans women of color. We are seeing them dying on the TV news day in and day out. As part of the asylum seeking process, these individuals have to prove that they've suffered some sort of past persecution at home, or that they have a well-founded fear of persecution. And this is a general process that all asylum seekers have to go through. And this process in itself can be very re-traumatizing. Having to open up and share your story about these things, it will relive the trauma for that person. LGBTQ asylum seekers specifically have to prove that their discrimination was based on their gender identity or sexual orientation. So these folks have had experiences in their home countries where they were hiding that part of them, were trying to go under the radar to not be discriminated against and victimized. And now, as soon as they come to this country, they have to convince decision makers that they are in fact LGBTQ, and their identity is now having to be put on display. During the process of asylum seeking for this population, they typically are detained 2 times as long as their counterparts, and they are 97 times more likely to experience sexual victimization during that detainment. And we know that folks who are seeking asylum are expecting that they're going to come to a place where their lives are going to improve, their mental health is going to improve, and then as they go through this process, they're living this re-victimization. A lot of these folks have had experiences of sexual victimization being preyed on prior to coming to the United States. And so this is certainly something that's traumatic and re-traumatizing for these individuals. LGBTQ asylum seekers also experience feelings of isolation and alienation during this process. Typically, folks who are not part of this community and are seeking asylum have the support of their family and friends or other members of their persecuted community so that when they immigrate here, they can connect with that community and easily have support there. But asylum seekers who are LGBT are often alone during the migration process, and it is a result of their LGBTQ identity. They also experience some difficulty when it comes to relating to other LGBTQ people here in the United States because of the cultural differences. There's also this idea of shame and this idea of being broken because of the history of persecution that they have gone through in the past. And also having to open up and share about all of these traumatic things is not something that folks want to go through over and over again when they're making new friends. And while they go through all of this, their ethnic communities here are communities where they can't go to for a source of support. These communities are actually sources of harassment and continued fear. So this adds to this idea of alienation and isolation. So despite all of these reported traumatic experiences post-migration, many of the investigations that have looked into this have looked at early life and pre-migration experiences of the LGBTQ asylum seekers. More specifically, there's little qualitative data that examines these experiences, examines the narratives of these folks, give these folks a voice so that we're able to look at their experience holistically. So this led us to go on with this study, and it was guided by this research question, which is, what are the experiences of trauma and adjustment of LGBTQ plus asylum-seeking individuals in the Washington, D.C. area? This is a qualitative study, and we used a phenomenological investigation. With phenomenology, we can get an in-depth understanding of the lived experiences of folks, and pure phenomenology has the assumption that there is an essence in the shared experience. And so this is something that we kept in mind as we're going through the study, as well as later on when we're going through coding and data analysis. We utilized a purposive sampling. So like I said previously, I spent some time during my first year as faculty here connecting with the local community organizations and centers that provide services to this population. And through that, we were able to recruit individuals. And for inclusion, they have to be 18 years of age or older. They had to self-identify as a member of the LGBTQ community. And they had to currently be seeking or have been granted asylum in the United States. For data collection, we used semi-structured interviews. And we wanted to keep these semi-structured because we wanted to have the freedom to ask more clarifying questions, to have more of a conversation with folks, especially because of trauma being such a sensitive topic. We wanted to have that freedom to be conversational, to respond to things that individuals are saying that are very heavy. So we had some questions that guided us along. But we also had that flexibility. Some of these questions were, what experiences would you describe as traumatic related to you being a member of the LGBTQ community pre and post your migration? How would you describe your experience of adjustment to the United States as an LGBTQ plus asylum seeker? And what were some barriers and supports to your adjustment here? Because this is a qualitative study, we wanted to ensure trustworthiness of our data. And so one of the things that we engaged in was reflexivity and bracketing. And we did that by a variety of ways. We dedicated one of our research team meetings to engaging in a reflexivity dialogue, where we talked about our biases, our assumptions, what we know about this population, our experiences with this population, and bracketing these things to make sure that we are not bringing our stuff into the data as we're going along. And we also engaged in a reflexivity journal where we continued this process, just reflecting on our own experiences, reflecting on our discussions together as a team, and individuals in the team also continued to have the journal so that they could put anything in there as they were going through encoding that came up for them. So the research team consisted of myself as well as Dr. Bagni Das, a faculty member in the Counseling and Human Development Department, and 3 of our counseling doctoral students, Han Yun Lee Angie Kiu, and Shiyu Tang. For our data analysis, we used in vivo coding as well as axial coding. So with in vivo, we used the participants' own words verbatim to examine their experiences. And this was really a way for us to honor those experiences. And then we went in after completing the first cycle of coding and did axial coding, where we created themes and categories by grouping things together, sorting and reducing the number of codes down to generate the findings of the study. We had 8 participants for the study. The sexual orientation reported, all 8 reported identifying as homosexual. As far as gender identity, 3 identified as male, 4 identified as female, and 1 identified as non-binary. 2 individuals were from Nigeria, 1 was from Tunisia and Egypt, 1 was from Yemen, 1 was from Indonesia, 1 was from Belarus, and 1 individual did not disclose. As far as race, 1 individual identified as Asian, 1 identified as Hispanic, 2 identified as Black, and 4 identified as Caucasian. The length of time in the US ranged between 2.5 months to 13 years. So we have folks here who have a big range of experiences of being in the United States. So for our findings, 5 themes arose in our study. These themes are pre-migration trauma, post-migration trauma, mental and behavioral health impacts of trauma, isolation and fear, and survival and resilience. And we had several sub-themes arise in the first 3 themes, and I'll share those with you as we continue. So for our first theme here, pre-migration trauma, the first sub-theme is violence inflicted upon the person. Our participants talked about experiencing physical violence, sexual violence, and verbal violence. At least one of these things, if not all 3. One participant shared, the traumatic experience was discovering my sexuality and it being used against me to take money, being pushed around, being retained within a small space for longer than usual time against my will. Not being able to go out, brought up being indoors because I'm scared of what I'll meet outside, not being able to meet friends because I'm also scared about their own safety, and experiencing physical trauma, verbal abuse, verbal threatening, emotional trauma, family disowning. We have so much, they're all traumatic. This participant spoke about their experience moving here from Nigeria and the extensive traumatic experiences that they had endured prior to coming here. Another participant added, when I was 7 years old, I was raped by my neighbor, and then I didn't tell my family about it, but it keeps repeating, the neighbor showing his genitals and stuff. So I told my mom, this person showing his genitals to me, and then my mom was just like, stay away from this person. This person is speaking to being victimized and being preyed on as it relates to being a member of the LGBTQ community. We had other participants also speak. Several of the female participants spoke about being preyed on if folks suspected that they were lesbians, and men forcing them to do sexual things or using derogatory terms to tell them, well, this is how you should be, or this is how I'm going to make you a woman. The second sub-theme here is non-affirming cultural messages. So individuals spoke a lot about anti-LGBTQ laws and how these were very traumatic for them, living through countries and societies where honor killings are something that happens, coming from homophobic families in a society, and how all of these things invalidated their identity and forced them to hide their identity and to not live freely. One participant shared, honor crimes were a big deal in Yemen and still a big deal. So if that was a space of a woman who have a relationship with men secretly, we are facing death. I could not even imagine what it would be as a gay to be discovered. This participant spoke about being forced at one point to get married to a man for her own safety. The same participant added, when you're classified as an infidel, anyone in the country can kill you on that ground. So even if there's not a law for homosexuality, the easiest way is to declare you an unethical. And that basically anyone can end your life or a relative can end your life on that ground and not face any punishment on their crimes. This participant elaborated a lot about the idea of honor killings and how that was something that she had to constantly be in fear of if someone found out about her sexuality. Another participant shared, in my home country with no doubts, since I can remember, I was taught by my family, by my school, by my neighbor, by my whole country in general, by church, that I should hate myself, and that I should hate the ones like me, and that I was a despicable and evil person. This person spoke a lot about how literally all of your support system, everything that you're surrounded by was telling you that you're evil and that you're despicable. The second theme here is post-migration trauma. And the first sub-theme is complexities of the asylum process. All of our participants spoke about how this process was lengthy, that they had no access to healthcare, had financial barriers, unemployment, experiences of being extorted, as well as homelessness. One participant shared, the system is so traumatic, and they're talking here about the system of applying for asylum. If you want to rent an apartment, you cannot because you don't have the right documents that's in the system. So the system itself is so corrupt that does not include asylum seekers to merge in the society in the right way. If I'm an asylee, I don't have a social security number yet. How am I supposed to rent an apartment? If I don't have a social security number, if I don't have a credit history, if I don't have a job in hand, how am I supposed to legally rent an apartment? Isn't that traumatic that you're trying to find loopholes within what you're already trying to deal with? You already don't have a job, you're waiting on your papers, and then you're dealing with how I'm going to open a bank account. How am I going to rent an apartment in a legal way? This participant later added on that, finding loopholes sometimes means having to find somebody that's able to rent an apartment on your behalf because you legally can't do that without a social security number. And this participant was lucky enough that she had a friend here who was able to do that, but also speaks to why many LGBTQ asylum seekers experience homelessness. Another participant added, it's been several years since I've been waiting for an invitation from immigration to my asylum interview. And since changes in the asylum law, there's really no way to know when it's going to be my final interview. It can be either in 1 year from now, or in 5 years from now, or in 8 years from now. It really kills me. This participant spoke to the lengthiness of the process of asylum and how you're sort of in limbo throughout the whole process. Many of these participants spoke. Later on, we'll talk about the theme of fear, but there's this fear that they could be deported anytime, and just not knowing and living for years with not knowing caused a lot of distress and trauma. The second post-migration trauma sub-theme is barriers towards adjustment. And these are all barriers that participants attributed to being traumatic to their adjustment experiences. These include having a lack of social cultural capital, language barriers, and lastly, political and geographical environment as a barrier. One participant shared, it kills me in so many ways reading the news related to immigration, since every single day the policies about asylum are getting harsher in this administration. The standard for granted asylum just goes up to the roof, with the actual intention being to refuse asylum to as many persons as possible and to start deportation as fast as possible. All of these interviews were conducted prior to the 2020 election, and this person is speaking to the current administration's views on asylum and their own experiences of reading things in the news and how the rhetoric towards immigrants and asylum seekers was a source of distress and a barrier towards their adjustment. Another participant shared, the things we need to do is how to make the life of an asylum seeker easier, especially those with really traumatic experience. And then they come here and we're re-traumatized again and again for different reasons, even for lack of resources, just like I was. It's different if you come to New York or DC. I mean, there are supports here, but for many other states, there's virtually no kind of support. This person spoke a bit about when they first came to the United States, they didn't come to the DC area. They spoke about moving to different places. I believe it was Ohio and West Virginia, and realizing that those places had no supports for them. And in addition to that, they also spoke about discrimination towards both of their identities as an LGBTQ person, as well as an immigrant. So the political as well as the geographical climate of the places that these individuals are relocating also had an impact on their adjustment experiences. The third theme, the mental health and behavioral impacts of trauma, starts with the sub-theme of mental health distress. All of our participants described having post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, anxiety, and/or suicidal ideation. One participant shared, I've suffered from depression and anxiety basically due to family pressures and societal pressures. When my mom found out that I was gay, she had this whole tantrum and threatened to kill me and threatened a bunch of other things. The usual, you're not my kid, I don't know you because I'm disgusted by your very existence, all that stuff. I've heard it all. So this participant spoke a lot about how all of these experiences have led to him having mental health distress and later on having issues with suicidal ideation as well. Another participant shared, very often I have these recurrent nightmares about being back in my home country and finding myself in my home country. And it's really traumatic because in these nightmares, I'm like, how is it that I ended up back here? It is so, so overwhelming. And then I wake up from this nightmare thinking that it was true. These nightmares are typical symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder. And many of our participants in this study shared that they've had nightmares, and all of them were related to being back in their home countries. The second sub-theme here is self-medicating behavior. Several of our participants mentioned utilizing self-harm and substance abuse as a way to self-medicate because of the symptoms that they were experiencing from the mental health distress. One participant shared, I had a drinking issue and not knowing, also another issue, not knowing alcohol's nature as a substance for addiction, because again, my home country is a dry country, so I was not aware of the impact of alcohol back then. And the traumatic part is it escalated from me being just a student and applying for funds to being in rehab, where they also introduced me to AA. AA is all about the powerlessness and the religious context of the higher power. All of that for me, all of that was for me very triggering and very scary. So this person, she had spoken about experiencing trauma prior to moving to the United States, experiences of trauma post moving to the United States, having some mental health distress, and as a result, going to self-medicate and utilizing substances to do the best that she can to move forward in life. And after all of these things, the service that she received, which is going to AA, was something that was triggering and re-traumatizing for her. So this is something that really speaks to the needs of providing competent services to these individuals and utilizing an intersectional lens when we're working with them. Another person shared, I started experiencing all of these horrible anxiety and depression and other panic attacks, and I didn't know what it was. It's years later that I was diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder. I did not have health insurance. I couldn't afford a psychiatrist with tremendous money. So I tried to self-medicate. My medication was alcohol. So eventually it turned out to be a problem with alcohol abuse. Um, Many of the participants, if not all, spoke about having no access to healthcare as an asylum seeker. And so we're seeing the results of not having any access to healthcare, and individuals who are experiencing mental health distress are having to self-medicate, and these issues are becoming much bigger issues. The fourth theme is isolation and fear, and participants spoke about this constant state of fear and isolation. The essence here is just there's this constant fear, constant isolation at all times. These are individuals who had their families cut off, either their family cut them off or they had to cut off their family because they were continuing to be abusive. They have a constant fear of being re-traumatized because if anyone has been traumatized, they know that that is just a horrible feeling and no one wants to be re-traumatized. So they're living in this fear and this anxiety. And there's also the constant fear of being deported. One participant shared, I'm excited about becoming a citizen and being able to travel again, but I'm so not looking forward to go to the Middle East to visit my family because then they can lock me up or they can prevent me from traveling back or whatever is going to happen. I don't know. Or one day I'll wake up and find myself married to some man. So I'm very anxious, and I can tell you my nightmares are active in terms of this scenario. I'm going to go back. I'm not going to be able to come back to the US, even though I'm a citizen. So even after individuals have attained asylum and have attained their US citizenship, they are continuing to suffer from some of these mental health issues, these nightmares, and continue to have a clear need for intervention here. Another participant shared, I'm here believing that this is the place that I'm going to feel protected, and I'm fearful of being homeless and jobless, and that's the biggest trauma. Like I had such moments that I was like, maybe I'll go back in the closet versus fearing having the fear of going to be on the street. So this participant, like several others, is speaking about weighing in their head whether it's worth being here and experiencing these difficulties, or if they should go back to their home country where they were victimized, experienced discrimination, and be in the closet and live there. The fifth theme is survival and resilience. All of our participants had such strength and had so much courage, and a lot of them spoke of this during our interviews together. You know, they had the strength of being able to pack up and flee, the strength of seeking support, as well as the resilience of being able to reframe what's going on, all of the trauma, and to cope through it. One participant shared, I lived in multiple homeless shelters and places like that, and I'm grateful that I never really experienced hunger, and I am so grateful that I never had to sleep in the streets. I had to sleep in very, very humble places that were like not very clean or not clean at all. A lot of canned food, a lot of mac and cheese, and not very healthy, but at the end of the day, I was full. So I was grateful, very grateful. Participants having this ability to be able to reframe using gratitude, using that as a framework for them to gain resilience. Another shared, in the Middle East, we don't go to therapy. So it's something very taboo. You know, I reached a certain point where I really was like, okay, I need someone professional to help because I cannot think to myself anymore. I'm like losing it. And that was my first time in my life. I'm 37 years old. It was my first time to go to therapy. I can't do this. I need help. We see here, this right here shows the individual's resilience in being able to seek support, even though they come from a background where seeking support is taboo. Going to mental health counseling is a taboo thing. But we see that I believe every single person that we spoke with had either seen a mental health professional or was currently in counseling. Another person added, the most important thing is at least we're still alive. It's better than, you know, getting killed or fighting to live your life, trying to be who you are for living freely. What matters right now is safety. They added, this is hard, kind of just drives me crazy, but boy, it is not compared to the trauma that I had back home. Nothing compares. Again, this idea of survival, this idea of having resilience and going through things and looking at things in a way where participants are reframing it to be able to move forward and to use it as a source of strength for them. All right, some points of discussions and implications of this study. I wanted to share with you all today some preliminary findings. We just finished this study and finished the data analysis several weeks ago. So here are some preliminary implications, and I'm happy to have further discussion with you all. So the first thing is that this contributes to the body of evidence that documents that LGBTQ asylum seekers continue to experience verbal, physical, and sexual abuse prior to immigrating here, and that they also experience some traumatic experiences here post-migration. These include, of course, the asylum process itself. This study also highlights the need for specialized assessment procedures and having interventions and policies that address the needs of this population specifically. And it also highlights the continued need to study post-migration experiences of this population. It's clear that there is a gap here when it comes to looking at the asylum-seeking LGBTQ individuals post-migration, and specifically looking at what are their experiences after gaining asylum and after having adjusted status, because I'm sure that that will change that experience of being in limbo. Some implications that are specific for counselors. Counselors are on the forefront of being able to provide support for this population through both clinical services and through advocacy. As counselors, we are taught that we have to be advocates for marginalized populations. And this study speaks immensely to the need to advocate for this population. One thing is to examine the impact of the state of trauma on adult development. So individuals spoke about trauma being something that they're just continuously going through. They've had trauma prior to moving to the United States, during the fleeing process, after moving to the United States, and it continues. So how is this state of trauma impacting adult development? Also, I spoke about using a lens of intersectionality a little bit earlier, but this is crucial. And we were fortunate, a couple of weeks ago, we had Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw, who spoke at the GW Diversity Summit. She spoke about critical race theory and intersectionality and all these things that she's well known for. And it was a great reminder for us that, especially during these times, looking at our clients, looking at our students, has to be from a lens of intersectionality. Some of the participants in the study spoke about religion and going to AA, for example. So looking at how religion plays a part in forming that identity for the person, and whether going to AA is something that's going to be beneficial or more harmful for them. Looking at things such as socioeconomic status and educational status. So some of the participants spoke about, having money from being back home and working as an adult back home and saving up money to be able to flee and to come to this country, and then spending all of that money on lawyers and the asylum process. Others spoke about fleeing the country with nothing and having to come here and find a pro bono lawyer. And with a lot of these cases, it was difficult for them to get things through or to have someone accept their case. So that's certainly a thing to be mindful of when working with this population. Another thing is racism, and recognizing racism as part of the intersectional identities of these folks. So one of the participants from Nigeria spoke about experiencing racism here for the very first time in his life. He is someone who identifies as Black, and he said that racism is just something that you don't go through in Nigeria. So coming here, and on top of being a member of the LGBTQ community, being an asylum seeker and an immigrant, recognizing that this person is based on being Black, was also experiencing another level of discrimination. So intersectionality will be huge in working with this population. Another implication is to advocate for a trauma-sensitive asylum process. All of our participants spoke about how the process itself was re-traumatizing for them. I see a lot of opportunities here for multidisciplinary collaborations. I see opportunities here with connecting with asylum offices, having asylum officers attend training, finding opportunities to provide trauma-informed training to these individuals, as well as connecting with folks from social work as well as law on creating some future multidisciplinary collaborations. All right, so I'm going to take questions at this point. Let me see here. Since I'm going to stop sharing, I just wanted to share a quick resource with you all. This is asylumconnect.org. This is a website that asylum seekers can go on and connect to that provides verified LGBTQ+ and immigrant-friendly services. It was started here in the United States and it has been expanding. I believe it's also in Canada and Mexico at this point. It provides services and resources for folks such as legal services, healthcare, mental health care, food, and supportive communities. It's a wonderful, wonderful resource. So I figured I'd share that with you all before stopping the screen here.
Hey, thank you, Dr. Attia, for this presentation. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Yeah, I think it was wonderful and great, and it does exactly what we should be doing as researchers, and that's giving a voice to the voiceless. So I thank you for that. Two questions, if I may, one from the legal standpoint and one from a methodological standpoint. From the legal standpoint, as someone that likes to think of himself as an immigration lawyer, what exactly do your findings specifically call for as modifications to the asylum process? Regardless of what administration is there, are there things we can learn from your research as lawyers and as immigration administrators that we don't know already about the ways that the process works right now, either post-Trump, pre-Trump, it doesn't matter, and things that we can improve on? The second question, if you don't mind, is you mentioned early on about positionality in your research team. And I've been studying a lot about objectivity of the researcher. And I would think, as someone who is bisexual myself, someone that's experienced the type of traumas that you described, it would be very hard to carve yourself out of this research. And I quite frankly would think it would help me empathize. How were those conversations with your participants? And, maybe talk a little bit about the process as a researcher of bringing yourself out of the research and the benefits or negatives of that.
Sure, absolutely. Thank you so much, Dr. Wright, for your question. I'm going to start off with your second question and then we'll circle back. As someone of this community, I went into this knowing that I'm going to have a hard time fully bracketing my experiences. But as you said, for me, I wanted to use it as much as possible to be able to empathize with these individuals. So we went through different processes here that started with having conversations with the research team and then doing a lot of our own self-reflections. It was really important for each member to take the time and reflect on their prior biases, their connection to the community, to do that on our own and then to reflect on them in a journal. I'll tell you that during some of the interviews, I had to either pause and step away, and a lot of times after the interviews I had to just take a break and a breather because the nature of them being so traumatic and having such a close connection to the community, I could see that it was really starting to impact me. So I had to find, sometimes I just had to find some things to do after these, go for a walk. But that's a great question. The first question you had as far as law and what from a law standpoint can be done. I'll tell you that this research points to the need for individuals in the law profession, individuals who are in the asylum process itself, the need to be trauma informed. I think that there needs to be trainings for individuals who are specifically working with this population on things such as how to talk about trauma, right? What are some appropriate ways of opening things up? Because we don't want to open up a can of worms and then find that we can't, maintain. So I would say that having some sort of trauma-informed training would be extremely beneficial.
Dr. Attia, there's a comment in the Q&A and a question. The comment is incredibly powerful and helpful to hear the actual voices of your participants. Thank you. And the question is, how did you go about not re-traumatizing with your methodology? That's excellent.
The first part of the question was, I'm sorry, can you repeat that first part again?
Sure. The first part is actually a comment thanking you for the work and saying it was incredibly powerful and helpful to hear the voices of your participants. And then, of course, the question is, how did you go about not re-traumatizing with your methodology?
That's an excellent question. And actually, one of the things that the IRB had for us when we submitted the study, as well as the site where we recruited participants, is how are you going to make sure that you're not doing this exact thing, that you're not re-traumatizing people? So we had several things in place for that. One of them being that every team member is either a counselor or is being supervised by a counselor. I mean, it was me, Dr. Das, who's also a therapist, and 3 of our counseling doc students. So we wanted to assure these folks that we are people who are trained in working with trauma. And besides that, I also had a list of resources for folks where they can get counseling. If that was something that happened, that they would be able to do that. And that was something that was asked by the site as well, to make sure that we had that.
Thank you. Dr. Freund has a question. I'm unmuting her now.
Hi, Mia. Thank you so much. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, good. Thank you so much. This was a wonderful presentation and made me think while you were talking about a brief interview I saw of Congresswoman Donna Shalala trying to describe the loss that she experienced in her re-election campaign a couple weeks ago in the Miami district. And she did it by describing the diversity of the population in the district of Latino, Latinx, many labels, which clearly she hadn't owned in the 2 years that she'd been in Congress and in the campaign prior. And as you were talking, I was thinking about the diversity of the populations that you've encountered in this small, important qualitative study. And I wonder, while you were speaking, what can we do in our roles here in the higher ed institution across the School of Ed that would help prioritize the kind of teaching and learning that all of our students need in order to be interactive with the communities that they're employed in currently or go out and work with their new after they complete their degrees with us. I wonder if you could just reflect on 1 or 2 priorities that would be important to the school and 1 or 2 priorities that you're going to take on as a result of this good work, perhaps with your team. Thank you.
Absolutely. So I'll start off with priorities for the school. As educators, what are some things that we need to do? I think it's very important for us to take on multicultural competence as something that we value and is very important for us. I know that Dean Foyer has been doing some tremendous things with putting this something on the forefront, especially after everything that's been going on in this country and creating diversity positions. So I think that one thing we need to do is to incorporate multiculturalism into our curriculums, into all of our classes, and to not make it that our students attend one multiculturalism class, but to really have this infusion in our syllabi, in our curriculum, in all we do, because it's important. And like you said, we're living in a world, we're living in a United States right now that is more diverse than ever. And it's going to continue being that way. And so we need to respond to that. The second thing I would say is for us to focus on hiring individuals from diverse backgrounds. That serves many purposes. One, when students are seeing that there are people like them who are teaching, who are, in positions as professors or higher ed administrators, et cetera, then they can see in themselves that this is something that I could do, and that there's someone here who represents me. There's someone here who may think the same way that I do. This may be a safer space for me if I'm finding someone like that. So I think that, that's another thing that we could do within our kind of educator role. As far as what we are going to do with the study, my plan is well, first off, we have to reach out to the participant. These are some preliminary findings. So we're going to reach out to do another trustworthiness check, which is to share these findings with the participants. And actually, we have our follow-ups coming up. We should be scheduling those soon. And that's the first thing that we're going to do. And the second thing is to continue being connected to the community. I'm very fortunate to have made these connections here. And I would like to see, myself and my research team creating some trauma-informed training that we can provide to folks who are working with this population. And, if I'm going to dream big, I'd like to be able to provide services, to provide access to services to individuals through these organizations. Yeah, so I would say that these would be the two things on my mind right now, but, other things will, of course, come up.
Dr. Attia, we have a follow-up question to the first question, which is, did you see the need to have translators? And were there any challenges there? And when you're done with that, Chris Dietrich has her hand up, and I'll unmute her when you've responded. Thank you.
So actually, we did not need translators for this study. Everybody spoke English well enough that we were able to have the study. Even though I don't know if I had that as part of my inclusion criteria slide, but all of our participants spoke English, so we did not need to use that. And I see that there is another question up here by Sarah Ray about our plans to sharing the findings. And as I said, we're going to be reaching out to our participants to share these preliminary findings before we publish anything, just to make sure that we're getting that additional level of member checking.
Okay, I've unmuted Chris. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Meg. Hi, Mina. Again, my name is Chris Dietrich, and we haven't met yet, but I hope to change that at the first GSEHD mixer this summer. I came to Washington in 1975, which means I was here in the advent of the AIDS crisis, which means I was here during the repression of the Reagan administration, which means I was here when all of our support organizations were built. Whitman Walker Clinic, we did phone banks, HRC, early members. We were able to find each other through pride events, we knew which restaurants to go to. We went dancing together. We met each other in very many different ways. And what I'm struck by today, as I was then, is that yes, Washington is a very welcoming place for the LGBTQ plus community. But Wheeling, West Virginia, I don't think is. What are these young people telling you? Where do you find support, friendship, community? I don't know how I would do it. Thanks, Meg.
Thanks so much, Chris. I'm very much looking forward to meeting you. I would say, so from the participants in this study, they describe DC being a very open community and very accepting community to the LGBTQ community, but they have a hard time connecting to other LGBTQ folks just because of that culture. One of my participants said that the culture of the LGBTQ folks here is very different from back home, and that it's something that makes them feel scared, just that difference. But the number one support that every single person mentioned is the organizations that provide LGBTQ services here. Specifically, there are organizations that provide services to asylum seekers who are LGBT, and that became the number one support for many of these folks. And from that, they started to branch out and they started to meet people, to feel a little bit more safe, because, like I was saying earlier, most participants did not want to be in close contact with folks from their private or their previous communities where they were victimized. Okay, I'm reading here.
I don't see any other questions in the Q&A or any hands raised.
Hey, Mina, since there's no one else asking, you mind if I do another one?
Go ahead.
So you talked a lot about intersectionality. I think you mentioned it, and I'm counting maybe about 12 times, a dozen times in your presentation. Were there any instances in which there were conflict amongst the refugee LGBT community because of intersectionality? Instances of patriarchy, instances of Christian versus Muslim, Shia versus Islam, instances of more out LGBT versus not, instances of gender identity versus not.
Dwayne, I can't think of any of those off the top of my head, but I bet if I go back through, I'm going to do another read through all of the transcripts before moving forward. I'm going to be on the lookout for that. Intersectionality in this case came up a lot when it came to folks experiencing racism for the first time, for example. And I really wanted to highlight that if we are not using a lens of intersectionality, then we're going to look at this group as a homogenous group. And today, even though I shared the shared experiences, the kind of the essence of what these folks are going through, by no means is this group homogenous. I mean, and I think that one of the follow-up things that I really need to do after this research is to look at different identities that are intersection within this community. I mean, we already know that being LGBTQ and being an asylum seeker, these are two marginalized identities. But what is it like if you are also a disabled person that is an asylum seeker that's LGBTQ, that's Black, right? That's going to give us a totally different experience. So I really appreciate that, Dwayne.
Just another follow-up. Do you think that the racism experienced by this subsector sample is qualitatively different than the racism experienced by those that aren't LGBT but are also asylum seekers? Meaning that holding the LGBT aspect, identity, social construction is constant, is there something special there?
I think that there's certainly something that's qualitatively different about this experience, but I'm uncertain about that, because we know that a lot of times with racism, it's people can discriminate based on their mere perception of you. So if the perception is, okay, you're Black, or if they perceive that you're gay, well, that'll be different. But it could just be something that, like this person had an experience based on their identity being a Black person. That could be similar to shared experiences of other Black men who might not be LGBTQ.
Dr. Hergenrather has a question.
Thank you, Meg. Hello, Mina. I enjoyed your presentation, and I just had a few questions for you. So we know that in regard to some of your participants that they shared sexual assault, sexual trauma. And we do know that in this country for women, it's approximately 1 in 3, and for men, it's between 1 in 4 to 1 in 6. And so we know that that is an issue. And we know that among gay men, and especially men who are HIV positive, it's about 50% of those men have been raped. And so the first aspect of this is, in looking at asylum seeking with this population, is addressing that concern in future studies, and also looking at, there are two aspects of that, which could be self-medication, and how is that used? So self-medication, sometimes we think of substances, sometimes we think of activities. Some people self-medicate who have been sexually assaulted through sexual intercourse, and sometimes people are re-traumatized, but then also some people are very resilient. And so one question would be, what have you learned from this in regard to the coping mechanisms of some of our participants? And what I mean by learned is, was there a theme? Did you identify a theme among some of the participants?
For taking the time to be here today. I really appreciate it. I think that's an excellent point about the experiences of sexual assault and how they could lead to other types of coping mechanisms. And I certainly think that this is a population that has found a way to be resilient, regardless of all of these traumatic experiences. I think that you mentioned in your question that you said how sexual assault can be something that is seen as a theme throughout this, and how self-medicating is something that could be seen as a theme. And I think the clear thing that we saw is that participants utilized alcohol as the main thing. And when they talked about it, they talked about it in a way that, they didn't run to alcohol because they knew, these things were going on. It was something that sort of just happened gradually, and they found themselves to form this problem. One of the participants spoke about not knowing what was going on. He knew that he was experiencing these symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder, and he knew that he had to move forward. And there was this thing in the middle, which was utilizing alcohol to kind of keep going. And I mean, not going to judge about the coping mechanisms of individuals. This is the way that they found how this is the way of moving forward. And through this, they were able to move forward and get to a point where they also realized that it was a problem, that there are other healthy ways of going about it. So I would say that the theme here is resilience. That's really what comes up for me. Using self-medication as a coping way and as resilience.
I see one more question in the Q&A, and that is, do you have specific ways to incorporate multiculturalism into our curriculum?
I think one of the starting points would be to find texts and articles, scholarly works that we include in our syllabi that are by diverse people, that address diverse viewpoints. I think that is the first thing that we need to do. And then from there, in making sure that the idea of multiculturalism is something that we talk about throughout our classes. And when something happens in the world, this is something that we address. But I'll go back to saying the first thing is making sure that the way that we are constructing our syllabi, that contract that we have with our students, really says a lot about us and about the class that they're going to take. And if we make sure that we are adding in their texts and scholarly work by diverse authors, that's a great starting point.
Are there any other questions? Dr. Hergenrather, please go ahead.
Thank you. Mina, I had one final question. We talked about the intersections of identities. And so one thing that I have found in my research on masculinity with men who have sex with men and looking at HIV risk behavior is sometimes there's a perception of masculinity and how behaviors should be perceived and how one should present oneself. And sometimes this doesn't necessarily align with, say, being gay or being within the community you addressed. And the research also suggests the same for a perception of femininity. When you were working with your population, was there any expressed conflict? And could you share that with us?
Absolutely. Absolutely. So for the second theme, I believe it's the second one of our study, the non-affirming messages, a lot of our participants actually spoke about how they presented and the way that they presented being a source of discrimination by other people in the community. So there was one female who spoke about not wanting to wear makeup and not wanting to have long hair, and how men in her community would say derogatory things to her just based on the way that she was displaying her femininity. And this person, I mean, their gender, this person identifies as a female. And so it speaks to the idea, again, of this intersectionality. You can, the idea of the way that you display your sexual expression is totally different from sexual identity. And so this was a common thing that came up in a lot of the interviews. Other participants who were men spoke about not being man enough, and this causing them to actually be physically harmed and having people either beat them or slap them. One participant spoke about being thrown down a hill, I believe, just some really traumatic stuff just based on the way that they displayed their gender expression.
Thank you, and I think something to look at is the most recent issue of Vogue magazine and the cover. If you're familiar with what I'm talking about.
I will definitely be on the lookout for that.
The singer who was, the singer who posed in women's clothing and how that was pulled.
I do know what you're talking about. I think it was Harry Styles.
Yes,
right?
It was. Yes, it just suggests about the cultural norms.
Absolutely, absolutely. Oh yes, I do remember all the backlash to that.
Thank you.
Shall we do a last call for questions?
Sure.
Okay. I don't see any hands raised, and I don't see any more questions in the queue. So on behalf of the dean and the school, thank you, Dr. Attia. That was wonderful, and we're very appreciative of your time. And thank you. And thank you to everybody for attending.
Thank you so much, Meg, and thank you to everybody who made the time to attend today.